Chapter 6. The Perfect Soldier. The 1988 seditious conspiracy trial held important lessons for the chief minds behind the white supremacist movement. When they leaned into their patriotism, their love of an America that was white and Christian, but America nonetheless, they could draw significant sympathy from their fellow white men and women. Swastikas and Klan robes were much less useful than tearful stories of hippie protesters spitting on flags. The 1990s saw continuous growth of both the survivalist and the American militia movement. Neither of these things was inherently white supremacist, but Beam and his colleagues had been remarkably successful at seeding their propaganda into gun shows and conventions. As a result, the early 90s brought them a whole new crop of fellow travelers, men and women who did not identify as Nazis and had never held Klan membership, but were also quite capable of reading the Turner Diaries and identifying with its message. Randy Weaver is a perfect example of this new sort of recruit. He was a former Green Beret, a patriot who loved his country and working with his hands. He and his wife, Vicky, were Christian conservatives. They fell in love with the first generation of evangelical TV preachers, men like Jerry Falwell. They also read a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, which focused around using the Bible to predict the near future. Lindsay's book convinced Randy and Vicky that Gog, an anti-Christian empire from the Book of Ezekiel, was the Soviet Union. They became more and more drawn into conspiracy theories and convinced themselves that a great and fiery apocalypse was imminent. According to American Experience by PBS, quote, "Concerned citizens, they set out to spread the word. They were unable to find a church that approached these matters with what they felt was the appropriate level of seriousness, so they held their own Bible studies with like-minded friends and neighbors. This sparked the attention of a local reporter who came to do a story on them. The Weavers, Walter learned, did not appreciate the results. They felt betrayed, but they had never been more sure in their beliefs. A great conflagration was coming, and they felt increasingly unsafe in Iowa. Vicky started having visions in the bathtub. God was speaking to her, and God was telling her to go west, to find for her family a mountaintop. They would be safe there." The Weavers moved to a place called Ruby Ridge in Idaho, not far from Richard Butler's Aryan Nations compound. Randy Weaver began to visit, attending several events and making a few friends among the neo-Nazis. The exact nature of what he believed precisely is unclear and heavily debated. He seems to have identified with some aspects of Christian identity theology, and it is safe to say that Mr. Weaver was pretty racist by normal people standards. But it's also probably fair to say that he was not really a Nazi or an ideological white supremacist. Randy hung around the Aryan nations because he didn't mind their racism, and because there weren't a lot of other people in rural Idaho, but he was not the sort of man who would have joined a group like the Order. Now, I'm not making a point of all of this to defend Mr. Weaver, but I am bringing it up because it's important to highlight the kind of men the evolving white supremacist movement had started to reach. Randy Weaver did not start spending time at the Aryan Nations compound because he wanted a white ethno-state. He was more interested in their picnics and hot dogs. The FBI wound up wiretapping several of the fascists that Randy Weaver befriended. It was quite immediately obvious that Mr. Weaver had no plans to overthrow the government, spark a race war, or do anything more subversive than live off the land with his family and occasionally picnic with Nazis. In fact, when other people in these wiretapped conversations would suggest committing crimes, Randy would generally say something like, "We don't really go in for that stuff." That stuff being, race war. While the feds knew Randy wasn't really dangerous, they saw him as the perfect guy to approach as an informant. He wasn't a true believer, and he was very poor. If they could entrap him into committing a crime, they could scare him with prison time until he agreed to wear a wire and help them catch some of the actual big fish in the Aryan Nations community. An undercover agent approached Randy and offered him good money to illegally saw off a couple of shotguns. Now, Randy was not a believer in the legitimacy of American gun control regulations, and he needed the cash, so he happily acquiesced and was subsequently busted for it. The feds made their offer, and Randy refused them. He was arrested on federal firearms charges and taken to jail. Randy managed to make bail, though, and he fled back to Ruby Ridge and holed up with his family and a fuckload of guns in the hope that the federales would not follow. They did. But the attempted arrest did not go well. A U.S. Marshal was shot dead by the Weaver clan, and the authorities responded with a blizzard of indiscriminate gunfire, killing Randy's 14-year-old son, the family dog, and his unarmed wife, Vicky. A standoff ensued. The law came in with helicopters, armored vehicles, and the kind of militarized police that look painfully familiar now, but were new and terrifying back in 1992. The media descended on Ruby Ridge, too, and the assault on the Weaver family spread virally throughout the far right. The Weavers were the perfect poster family to illustrate government overreach. Footage of black helicopters hovering over Ruby Ridge and saint-like pictures of Vicki Weaver were almost tailor-made to sell the idea that the New World Order was coming for decent, white, Christian, gun-owning Americans. Louis Beam and his fellow fascists knew a perfect opportunity when one came knocking. Later in 1992, while Ruby Ridge was still in the news, the leading minds of the white supremacist movement gathered in Estes Park, Colorado, for a summit on how, precisely, they could use this tragedy to their advantage. The summit was convened by Pete Peters, a Christian identity preacher from Colorado and the head of a sizable Christian identity church, the LaPorte Church of Christ. Here's how Leonard Zeskin summarizes the proceedings in Blood and Politics. For 2.5 days, they met in committee, deliberated in plenary sessions, and engaged in the kind of one-on-one conversations known, in the parlance of business professionals, as networking. They made decisions in the name of Jesus Christ and Yahweh, sang "Onward, Christian soldiers," and otherwise conducted themselves in a manner of quiet resolve appropriate for their surroundings. A YMCA facility abutting the park. No guns were waved, and even the most heated rhetoric seemed to have the blood drained out of it. Estes Park would come to signify a radical shift in the tactics of the white power movement. Like the 1983 Aryan Nations Congress, we mostly know what was discussed at Estes Park because of the things that happened after it. Louis Beam published an article in his new magazine, ironically named The Seditionist, and called for leaderless resistance in the wake of Ruby Ridge. Big Star 1, a militia with members in Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, carried out grenade launcher and mortar training exercises in rural Texas. The Montana militia published a guidebook on how to engage in domestic terrorism. In 1993, law enforcement across the nation found 13 explosive caches meant to be used in attacks as varied as a National Afro-American Museum in Ohio and a black church in Los Angeles. None of this made the news in a big way because of something that happened in mid-1993, the siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians were not a Christian identity sect, and David Koresh was not affiliated with the white supremacist movement, but the ATF siege of their compound so soon after Ruby Ridge was easy for Louis Beam and his comrades to propagandize around. This is not an audiobook about the Waco disaster, and I won't even try to cover what happened there in detail. What's important for our purposes is the end result. On February 28, 1993, ATF agents attempted to serve a search warrant about the sexual abuse and illegal weapons charges. People inside the compound opened fire. 4 agents and 5 Branch Davidians were killed, and the situation devolved into another siege. On April 19th, the FBI, who'd taken control of the situation, launched an all-out assault on the compound. In the ensuing melee, several fires broke out and quickly swept through the structures. By the time the smoke had cleared and it was all over, 53 adults and 23 children were dead. Not all of those people were killed by federal agents or smoke inhalation. Several were shot by their fellow cult members. But the whole tragedy was inarguably a clusterfuck on behalf of the federal government. It was, in fact, exactly the sort of clusterfuck Beam and his comrades had been waiting for. Kirk Lyons, a close friend of Louis Beam and a white supremacist militia leader himself, sent out an issue of his group's fundraising newsletter that featured a photo of a smiling 14-year-old girl who died in the Waco siege. The girl was, of course, white, and her photo was captioned, "Why We Fight." There were dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of other similar pieces of propaganda. Gradually, day by day and month by month, explicitly fascist white supremacist groups began to wrap their ideological claws around the militia movement and suck in ever more patriots. British journalist John Ronson was one of the few reporters who spent a great deal of time embedded with the fringe right during this period. He actually visited the ruins of the Branch Davidian compound near Waco in 1999 with Randy Weaver in tow. They wound up having a conversation with several members of the Michigan militia who were there taking part in a vigil for the people who died at Waco. One of them told him, "We are here to ask these people's forgiveness for sitting around on our butts and watching it on TV. What happened at Ruby Ridge and Waco will never happen again, under any circumstances. If it does, there will be immediate retaliation, armed resistance from the Michigan militia." Now, in Blood and Politics, Zeskin notes that in the wake of Ruby Ridge and Waco, the Michigan militia surged to more than 12,000 members, including a young Desert Storm veteran named Tim McVeigh. Timothy James McVeigh was born on April 23, 1968. He grew up mostly in Pendleton, New York, and had an early childhood that was pretty standard for the 70s and 80s, watching Gumby and Truth or Consequences, playing cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers with other kids in the neighborhood. Tim preferred playing the good guys as he saw them, cops or cowboys whenever possible. He was sickly and somewhat prone to accidents, hurting himself in all sorts of ways young boys who spend a lot of time in and around the outdoors tend to do. Tim was an energetic boy, and he might have been someone who'd have wound up on Ritalin had he been born a decade or two later. He was constantly in trouble for minor things, but he also had a good heart, as this story from American Terrorist, the fantastic biography of McVeigh, makes clear. Tim was playing near the pond when he noticed one of the older neighborhood boys carrying a burlap sack. The sack was weighted down with rocks, but the curious Tim could see there was something else wriggling around in the sack. He watched as the older boy pitched the sack out into the pond, where it quickly sank to the bottom. "What was that?" Tim asked, running around the far shore of the pond where the neighborhood boy stood. "Those are kittens my cat had," the boy answered in a matter-of-fact tone. "We had to get rid of them." For Tim, who loved animals, and especially kittens, the realization of what he had witnessed hit him hard. He cried about the incident for days. Tim fell in love with guns at an early age. His grandfather took him shooting when he was 7. This probably sounds crazy to a lot of people, but it's actually quite normal in rural America. I myself had an upbringing not all that different from Tim's, albeit in rural Oklahoma, and I was around 7 the first time my uncle took me out shooting. Tim's grandpa, Ed McVeigh, was a stickler about firearm safety and considered safe gun ownership to be an integral part of American citizenship. Being small and sort of weird, Tim McVeigh was a bit of a magnet for bullies. He developed a deep hatred of bullying and a reflexive rage at the sight of anything he saw as bully behavior, whether it was from an individual or an institution. Tim's parents divorced when they were young. His sisters chose to go with their mother, but Tim stayed with his father so that he would not have to be alone. After the Oklahoma City bombing, a number of pundits would try to tie Tim's parents' divorce to his evolution as a terrorist. That would seem to be an overstatement, but he did tie his mother leaving his father to broader social trends, later stating in an interview that, in the past 30 years, because of the women's movement, they've taken an influence out of the household. When one reads about McVeigh, they get the feeling that had he been born later, he might have found a home within the alt-right. He was obsessed with the Star Wars movies and identified heavily with Luke Skywalker. As the 80s rolled along and home computers started to become more common, McVeigh became one of the first generation of computer nerds. He was on the internet before almost anyone else. His handle on those early boards was The Wanderer. We can't know everywhere he went in the early internet, but it's unlikely to be pure coincidence that Tim McVeigh grew obsessed with survivalism and the Second Amendment during the years when he was most involved in nascent internet culture. It's entirely possible he came across some of Louis Beam's writing in this time. We know for a fact that he fell in love with a book I've already discussed at length in this series. Timothy McVeigh first heard about the Turner Diaries from an ad in Soldier of Fortune magazine. He ordered the book by mail and fell madly in love with it. For the rest of his life, he'd insist that the book's gun rights advocacy was what drew him to it, not its depiction of a genocidal worldwide race war. And it is possible he was telling the truth about this. Post Estes Park, the Turner Diaries remained one of the linchpins of white supremacist recruitment in the United States. Ads for it in magazines like Soldier of Fortune often pose the question, what will you do if the government comes for your guns? None of this is to say that McVeigh wasn't racist. He grew up in a place where everyone was white. At age 19, he got a job as a guard on an armored car. He later recalled his colleagues expressing casual racism towards black residents on the east side of Buffalo, and eventually adopted these beliefs and their propensity for using racial slurs. Racism was a fact of Tim's life, but it was not the major motivating factor in his behavior. What were guns. During his time as a security guard, McVeigh spent most of his recreational time shooting. He eventually got in trouble with his neighbors for doing so, and this seems to have influenced his desire to join the military. McVeigh was an excellent Army recruit, and by all accounts, a very good soldier. He fell in love with most aspects of military life, although he disliked the emphasis training placed on killing. In a later interview, he recalled, 20 times a day it would be, blood makes the grass grow, kill, kill, kill. You would be screaming that until your throat was raw. If somebody put a video camera on that, they would think it was a bunch of sickos. On base, McVeigh continued to read far-right literature, devouring conspiracy theories about the United States and the UN conspiring to steal the freedoms and guns of Americans. He handed out copies of the Turner Diaries to his closest comrades. He was warned several times by friends who read the books that people would think he was a racist if he kept passing that shit around. The Gulf War would give Tim McVeigh his first chance to actually use violence against other human beings. And interestingly enough, he seems to have hated it. He was not on board with the war from the beginning. McVeigh felt the U.S. military should only get involved in conflicts that directly affected the lives of American citizens. He saw U.S. intervention against Iraq as bullying, and Tim McVeigh still hated bullies. When he shipped over to Iraq, McVeigh was the gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle. During a battle in-country, he killed 2 Iraqi soldiers with the Bradley's very large gun and watched in horror as their bodies disappeared into a red mist. The incident scarred him. Unlike Louis Beam, McVeigh did not enjoy killing. The whole war left a bad taste in Tim's mouth. He was particularly furious when he read about the U.S. Air Force bombing of the Al-Amira bomb shelter in Baghdad, which killed 300 people, mostly women and children. McVeigh returned to the United States significantly less enchanted with military life. He focused some of that frustration on the black soldiers he served alongside. Several of them walked around the base in Black Power t-shirts, which infuriated Tim. He was heard several times using the N-word and had a reputation for ordering some of his black subordinates to sweep up the motor pool. When pressed about this later, McVeigh would point out that some of his closest comrades in the military were black. I'm going to quote again from American Terrorist. While he swore he never embraced racism, McVeigh actively explored the racist point of view. He had already begun selling copies of the Turner Diaries at gun shows, and because of the racist content of the book, McVeigh wound up on a mailing list for the Ku Klux Klan. McVeigh claimed he had virtually no idea what the KKK was all about the first time he received literature from the racist group. He was impressed by one of its pamphlets, which expressed concerns about the loss of individual rights in American society, and a desire to go back to the way things were in the days of the Founding Fathers. McVeigh sent $20 for a trial membership to KKK headquarters in North Carolina. One of the enticements for joining was a White Power t-shirt that McVeigh planned to wear around Fort Riley. Why would a non-racist want a White Power t-shirt? McVeigh maintained it was intended to protest what he saw as a growing double standard in the Army. He said that he never did wear the shirt, but he made no apologies for buying it, then or now. I wanted to make a point, he said. Black guys were wearing Black Power shirts on the base. They weren't supposed to. I wanted to see what would happen if I wore the White Power t-shirt. McVeigh did not renew his KKK membership when his first year was up. He had joined the KKK, he says, because he thought the Klan was fighting for the restoration of individual rights, especially gun rights. But the more research and reading he did, the more he realized that the Klan was almost entirely devoted to the cause of racism. McVeigh's enemies weren't blacks, they were politicians who were pushing more gun laws. He decided that the KKK material was manipulative to young people. Tim McVeigh, like Randy Weaver, was a perfect example of the sort of man Louis Beam was hoping to reach. Not motivated by racism enough to have sought out the movement, but comfortable enough with racism and frustrated enough by a mainstream American culture to be radicalized by the anti-gun control New World Order conspiracies peddled by the propagandists of the White Power movement. McVeigh opted not to re-enlist after his time of service ran out, and outside of the military, McVeigh's life was one frustration after another. Despite his glowing service record, he had trouble finding work and was turned down for several civil service jobs he applied for in the state and federal government. He convinced himself that this was because he was a young white man, and thus the victim of what he termed reverse discrimination. Affirmative action became the focus of McVeigh's thwarted ambitions. He started spending more time around gun shows and flirted vaguely with some militias, including the Michigan militia. He started sending his sister, Jennifer, stories he'd read about the Rockefeller family and their supposed control of most of the organs of state power. The conspiracies McVeigh embraced weren't quite open neo-Nazi anti-Semitism, but they were kissing cousins to that sort of belief. From American Terrorist, quote, "The brother and sister's discussion sprawled in myriad directions, from the Bible to the pyramid and its crowning all-seeing eye on the back of the dollar bill. McVeigh was reading more anti-government books and pamphlets, and he shared them with his inquisitive younger sister. He wanted to expand her perspective, although some of the claims in the literature seemed bizarre and inconceivable to Jennifer, including one writer's contention that the government was building massive crematoriums and 130 concentration camps to exterminate individuals who disagreed with federal policies. The authors of the pamphlets, anticipating skepticism, warned that Americans risked becoming victims of the "it can't happen here" syndrome when it came to government usurping power from the people. Jennifer wasn't sold on everything she read, but just as McVeigh hoped, the literature got her thinking about the government and individual rights. She looked up to her older brother, flattered that he thought enough of her to engage her in political discourse. McVeigh believed the federal government intended to disarm the American public gradually and take away the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. In the summer of 1992, he pointed to the events in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, as proof positive that his theory was correct. One of the publications McVeigh read was called The White Patriot. It's a magazine that was published by former KKK leader and Stormfront founder Don Black. It featured articles with titles like, "Why is the Klan opposed to Jews?" and also hosted essays from William Pierce. As McVeigh's life prospects dimmed, he grew more obsessed with guns and gun shows, traveling around the country, selling weapons and literature and survivalist gear. The gun show circuit introduced him to more fringe right-wing literature. McVeigh began to express frustration that American women were unfairly withholding sex from American men. He called them prudish and stingy. When the Waco siege began, McVeigh was instantly obsessed with the story. He drove to Mount Carmel and sold T-shirts outside the siege lines, communing with his fellow survivalists and militiamen as they worriedly waited for the outcome. And when that outcome came, it radicalized Timothy McVeigh, as nothing else could have. He read that the government had used CS gas, which McVeigh had been exposed to during his military training. This, to McVeigh, was the ultimate representation of government overreach, pure, vicious, murderous bully behavior. But McVeigh didn't stop at being furious about the murder of dozens of innocent people. He became convinced that Waco was the prelude to a mass government crackdown on gun owners and freedom. He told one friend that he suspected the feds had purposefully started fires in the compound. The government wanted it to burn because the government couldn't win. The public sentiment was changing. McVeigh's rage was reciprocated by the other men he met on the gun show circuit, men like Terry Nichols, a sovereign citizen whose beliefs were essentially descended from the posse comitatus movement. McVeigh spent time living on Nichols's farm and crafting explosives, small homemade bombs initially just for the purpose of amusement. But over the months that followed Waco, McVeigh's rage and the paranoia stoked by years of fringe-right conspiracy theories and his love of the Turner Diaries started to metastasize into a plan to bomb the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The structure of McVeigh's attack was directly inspired by a passage from the Turner Diaries. At one point, Earl Turner's cell bombs the FBI's headquarters. Pierce goes into exhaustive detail about the device they used, a truck bomb made with 4,400 pounds of ammonium nitrate, essentially the same weapon McVeigh constructed and used to destroy the Murrah building. On the day he detonated his bomb, killing 168 people, McVeigh put a sort of manifesto together in an envelope in his car. It included many photocopied pages of the Turner Diaries. McVeigh highlighted one passage in particular from a chunk of the book where Earl Turner's cell carries out a mortar attack in Washington, D.C. Quote, "The real value of our attacks today lie in the psychological impact, not in the immediate casualties. More important, though, is what we taught the politicians and bureaucrats. They learned this afternoon that not one of them is safe beyond our reach. They can huddle behind barbed wire and tanks in the city, and they can hide behind the concrete walls of their country estates, but we can still find them and kill them." And Timothy McVeigh, Louis Beam, and his fellow fascists had found the perfect soldier, and the perfect exemplar of Beam's concept of leaderless resistance. He was not a lone wolf, as some foolish pretenders of journalism have named him. McVeigh was radicalized by a constellation of writers and thinkers, as well as hundreds of men he spoke with at gun shows and survivalist conventions, and sitting outside the siege lines at Waco. He was radicalized by William Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, hoping desperately that some young man would read it and do exactly what McVeigh did. McVeigh's attack prompted a response from the federal government, but not the one you might expect. While there were some crackdowns of militia cells and organizations, the Justice Department largely reacted by taking a lighter hand with white supremacists and militias. In 1996, the Montana Freemen wound up in a standoff with the federal government. As a group, they represented the synthesis of Christian identity and posse comitatus beliefs. They declared themselves independent of federal control and wound up in an 81-day standoff with law enforcement. For a while, it looked as if the Freeman compound might wind up being another Waco. But then the standoff ended peacefully. Video footage of the 23 adults and 4 children surrendered showed no giant armored vehicles or military-looking police. The FBI's hostage rescue team wore sneakers and casual civilian clothing. McVeigh would go to his grave convinced that the lighter hand used on the Montana Freemen was the result of his attack on Oklahoma City. And, according to American Terrorist, quote, Clinton R. Van Zandt, the former FBI agent who had tried without success to negotiate a peaceful end to the Waco standoff 3 years earlier, agreed with McVeigh, at least on that point. Retired from the FBI and working as a security consultant, Van Zandt feels that the government learned a painful lesson from the Oklahoma City bombing. In Van Zandt's words, the government realized that it must become a velvet brick, not a battering ram. What an absolute classic tragedy, Van Zandt said soon after the conflagration of Waco. What a total indictment of mankind's inability to communicate and relate, even though we have different religious or personal philosophies. While Van Zandt condemned the Oklahoma City bombing, he felt that Waco had started a war, and that McVeigh's bombing had been not only an escalation, but a turning point in that war. Now, my main disagreement with Mr. Van Zandt is just with the idea that the war McVeigh wound up fighting and started with Waco. This war has been going on way longer than that, and it started at least as far back as the days of George Lincoln Rockwell. Timothy McVeigh may have seen himself as a patriotic American, but he fought as a soldier of the American fascist movement under General Louis Beam and Field Marshal William Pierce. The failure of the federal government, and almost everyone really, to see this war is one reason why things have gotten so bad as they have in 2019, the year that I write this. McVeigh has been joined on down through the years by dozens of other angry young white men like Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the infamous Columbine shooters. Most experts agree that Harris was the primary motivating force behind the attacks, more or less pulling Klebold along with him. It's not often reported on, but Harris was obsessed with Adolf Hitler and Nazism. He wrote constantly about Nazi ideology, his hatred of free speech, the press, and his desire to see mentally defective people executed. Harris was also obsessed with Timothy McVeigh. Dave Cullen is a journalist who spent more than a decade studying the Columbine massacre. He found regular references to Oklahoma City and McVeigh in Harris's writing. Cullen writes, in his journal, Eric would brag about topping McVeigh. Oklahoma City was a one-note performance. McVeigh set his timer and walked away. He didn't even see his spectacle unfold. Harris admired McVeigh, but desperately wanted to beat him, carrying out a larger attack and killing more people. He did not succeed in his lifetime, but Harris may yet manage to beat McVeigh's high score. In the decades since the 1996 shooting at Columbine, it has inspired at least 74 copycat attacks, which have killed 89 people and injured 126 more. You can draw a direct line from George Lincoln Rockwell to William Pierce and Louis Beam to Tim McVeigh and Eric Harris. By the late 1990s, it was incredibly clear that leaderless resistance, as a tactic, was the best weapon in the white supremacist arsenal. But it would take the mass adoption of the internet and the era of the smartphone for Louis Beam's deadliest innovation to see its full potential.